Welcome to the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Hideaway. The photograph on the right is the inspiration for this painting. It's a simple farm building sitting out on the edge of a field. I begin with a simple pencil sketch using a B pencil on a quarter sheet 11 by 15 inches of 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. Before I begin to paint, there's a few areas where I'm going to put some liquid masking fluid using a fine line masking fluid dispenser. And one of them is this pole. I just want to maintain a thin highlight on this pole, so I'm going to use some liquid masking there. And then the other area that I want to mask is the wire that coming down from the top of the page. I'm going to mask just the leading edge of that, and I'll use a combination of positive and negative when I paint this both of these lines coming in. So right at the ends they're going to be lighter, going over darker shapes, and then as they go over the light sky they're going to be darker value. This is a list of colors that I used in this painting. I used quite a variety. I begin with cerulean blue, and my formulation is PB36. Sometimes the PB35 formulas are a little too green to get the mixtures I get. I used royal blue, cobalt blue, rose madder quinacridone, alizarin crimson quinacridone, pyrrole red, quinacridone gold, cadmium yellow light, raw sienna, sap green, permanent green light, and raw umber. I'm going to start my painting with a sky wash, and before I begin to paint, I mix a pool of my color on my palette. And my colors are pretty much arranged cool on one side, warm on the other, and I tend to mix in the two wells that way. And right now I have the cerulean blue, and I put in just a touch of rose madder. And you can see that I'm mixing a big pool of color. I'm going to apply a sky wash using the mixture of cerulean blue and rose madder quinacridone. I'm using a 1-inch brush. It's a 1-inch wash brush. It's a flat brush. And I'm applying a generous amount of paint to the paper. I'm working wet on dry, and my brush is fully saturated with the wash mixture. I mixed the big puddle on my palette, so I have plenty of paint to load my brush with. And I bring this wash down the page. I'm working at about a 15 to 20 degree angle. So the wash is coming down the page with gravity, but it stops when it hits the dry paper, and I can control where it goes. With my 1-inch brush, I'm leading the leading edge of this wash around the shapes as I need to, and I can take that bead of water and I can lead it down the page. So the dry paper is going to resist the flow of that paint, but once I go over with my brush, then the paint will flow. And I want to keep that bead of water so that it doesn't set an edge as I'm working on another area. And here you can see I just bring that wash down to the edge of what will eventually be a tree line. And I want to pick up some of that water, that mixture that's pooled there, and on those wires where I have a little bit of masking fluid, it tends to dam the water there and pool up. So I want to pick that up or it'll create a backwash eventually. Now I'm taking that wash on the other side of that pole, and I'm painting over top of this tree shape because in the end some of that sky is going to be coming through the leaves and the branches, and it's going to be a much darker value, so I have no concerns with this blue showing through the tree and the trunk or any of the branches, because they're going to be much darker value. They're just going to cover over this wash. Here I'm going to dry it with a hair dryer. And when it's a very wet wash like this, I'll try to keep my hair dryer a little higher and farther away from the paper so it doesn't blow any puddles around. and then I'll gradually work my way closer to the paper as it begins to dry up. Next, I'm going to paint some of the shadowed areas on the building, and to do that I'm going to mix together some cerulean blue and raw sienna, and I'll use these two together, and I'll vary the ratio so I have a combination of both warm and cool colors. And as I mentioned when I read the list, that's the cerulean blue I'm using uses a base pigment of PB36. Sometimes the brands that use PB35 as a base pigment tend to have a greener cast to them, and you might struggle to get some of the colors I get using these two in combination. You'll get a result that's much greener, so that's just something to be aware of. Now I'm going to use some of this cerulean blue and raw sienna mixture to paint some of the shadowed areas of the building. So I'm just using a number 4 round brush and painting the edge of the roof there. And that's a warmer tone, and continuing underneath that roof line, still with a warmer tone. So the ratio of the two colors in this mixture has a larger percentage of the raw sienna, which makes it warmer. And you can see that that's almost pure raw sienna that I'm using there. And then I'm going to pick up some of the mixture which has a little more blue in it and is leaning towards the cool side. So the mixture that I'm applying at this moment has a greater ratio of a greater amount of cerulean blue in the mixture. So you can see that just becomes one continuous wash though, and I'm just leading the bead of water down just as I did with my sky wash. However, periodically I'm changing what I'm loading my brush with from warm to cool with the mixtures that I have on my palette. And here I'm just going to lead that wash down, and you can see where my pencil line is that defines the shape of this shadow. So you can see that it's much warmer at the top and it's cooler towards the bottom. And normally when I'm doing a wash like this, I'll have just touches of warm and cool alternating as I bring the wash down the page. Here I'm just completing the shape that is created by this shadow, and then I'm going to take some of the same tone on the overhang that's on the end of this building and paint the shadowed area of that, which is almost a continuation of the shadow on the side. That kind of is just one big shape. Now I'm going to paint the shadowed end of the building, and to do that I'm going to add to the mixtures on my palette. I'm using some cobalt blue, and I've added some rose madder quinacridone to that. So this color that I'll be using on the shadowed side on the end of this building will be leaning more towards violet than the cerulean, the blue that the cerulean blue was. And I've added some raw sienna to help neutralize that a little bit. And I'll still have little touches of warm and cool when I do that wash. So using those mixtures that are on the palette, I'm going to paint the shadowed side of the shadowed end of this structure. So right now I'm painting the underside of where the roof hangs over. And I started with a warm wash of raw sienna, and then I'm taking a darker, cooler mixture from the other end and bringing it into that wash. And I want to keep a clean edge here, so I'm going to dry this quickly before I do the rest of that shape. I'm going to continue to paint that shadowed end of the building, and right here I'm going to paint the edge of the roof line with a cool mixture. It's kind of a blue violet, using the cobalt blue and the rose madder, but also has a little bit of raw sienna in it, so it's not as bright. And that raw sienna tones down the violet. And I'm going to paint this other edge. So these shadows are a little deeper, a little cooler than on the other side of the building. And I'm going to take it over this whole shape. But as I start to apply this paint, I start to think about that edge of the roof on the right that I just painted. And I don't want that there to bleed into what I'm going to put down. So once again, I'm going to soften that, and then I'm going to quickly dry it. So now it's dried. I'm going to resume the wash that I was just starting to put on that larger shape at the end of the building, and I didn't want it to bleed into the edge of the roof. So that's been dried. Now I'm applying this much cooler, kind of a blue-violet wash on the end of the building here. And you can see I have a combination of blue and blue-violet, and I'm going to soften those edges where that wash comes down, and blot it with a tissue, again, to help soften that up a little bit. There's an edge there that I wanted to fine a little bit more. It casts a shadow underneath it, so I'm taking a mixture that has a little bit more raw sienna in it, so it's still fairly warm, and I'm following the edge of the board that's under the roof, and I'm going to take a little bit of water and diffuse that and let that soften as it goes away from the edge of the board. I'm going to take, I think, a little bit of a cooler mixture also, and just put right into that wet wash. So because I'm painting on wet paper, it's wet heading away from the edge there. That color is going to diffuse into the wet paper. I'm going to take some color from my mixtures that I have on my palette here, and I'm going to paint this transformer that's up on this electric pole. So just painting the shadowed side of that, and I'm going to leave the side that has the light source shining on it alone. Next, I'm going to paint some of the foliage that's in the distance, some of the tree line. So I'm going to set my palette up to do some of that brush work. So I'm working with sap green, some raw umber. I'm using Pyro red, and I'm going to set up a variety of greens here, warm and cool, and some fairly dark valued mixture. Here's just sap green with a little quinacridone gold to give a little bit of a brighter touch. But I'm also going to take some of that sap green and add some of the royal blue to it, which is going to give me a dark, cool green mixture, and I'll add a little raw umber to it to tone it down a little bit. So here I've set my palette up with a variety of greens that I'll have at my disposal to paint the distant tree lines. So I've loaded my brush up with some of the green mixture, and I'm just going to paint this shape here that represents the distant tree line. I'm going to bring that value across. There's an area there right below where I was just painting that's an open shape where that pole overlaps, and it's right below that line that I just painted. And I want that to be kind of a bright yellow green area to give the impression there that there's an open field behind this building. So you're not going to see a lot of it because of the angle and your line of sight. But I'm going to have that kind of a brighter green in between the tree line and some of the grassy foreground area. So I started to paint this shape with a fairly warm middle value green, and now I'm coming in with a darker valued green that's also cooler, so it has a little bit more royal blue in that mixture, and just now I have a combination of some warm and cool greens that make up that distant tree line. Now I'm taking that same mixture and I'm painting the tree line here on the other side, and the shapes that are formed between the building and the pole. So I have my brush loaded up. My brush is saturated, so it's got quite a bit of paint in it. And when I just touch my brush to the paper, that paint just discharges down onto the page. But I still have full control because I'm working wet on dry, so I can get nice clean edges with that. Here I've moved to the other side of that pole on the building, and I'm continuing this dark shape that's being overlapped by some of the shapes in the foreground. I'm going to take this dark value down towards the base of this tree line, and where that comes down, it actually meets an area of kind of grassy shapes that are overlapping it. So to give the indication of those grassy shapes below it, I'm actually going to take that pigment, which is wet right now, and I'm going to drag it down, which is going to create the suggestion of grassy shapes below it. Although it's white paper right now, it'll allow me to put a light valued wash over that, and it'll give the impression of those grassy shapes going over top of the dark shape in the background. You have to plan ahead to accomplish that, because unless you're using opaque paint, which I don't use, you'll lose your ability to bring those grassy shapes up into to the dark shape if you don't plan for it ahead of time. Because once this is dry, I won't be able to take a lighter value over it. So what I've done is I've planned ahead and drug some of that dark value down to suggest those grassy shapes would be coming up and overlapping the dark shape. So I bring this tree line across. I'm painting over top of what's eventually going to be the trunk of the tree, but I don't care, because that's going to be actually the darkest value in my composition. If you look at the photograph, you can see how the trunk of the tree on the top right there just blends right into the foliage and the tree line and everything. Kind of becomes one shape. So when I paint that trunk, it's very close in value to this tree line that I've painted. Now I have a small shape created by the pole and the building and the activity of the tree line here. So I'm going to paint that area between the building and the pole using the same dark green value. Now there's an area here behind the building, between the building and the tree line, that is the open field, and I want to represent that with a light green wash. So I have a brighter mixture that has some cad yellow light and some permanent green light. And this is just about really the only place I'm going to use it, is in this to paint this kind of a brighter open field area. And I want to paint it so that it comes out on the other side of the building too, so you can kind of see it coming out both sides, and you're not wondering what happened to the edge of that. There's a darker area of grass or some plants here on the end of this building, so I'm going to paint that now with this dark value while I have it on my palette. Once I'm done painting that, I'm going to take a fine mist spray here and just hit the bottom of that and let that run a little bit. And that just kind of creates a nice softer edge, suggesting those weeds just kind of transitioning down into the shapes that are created by the grass in the foreground. I'm going to try and create the similar effect on this side, so I'm putting some touches of paint where I've already painted, and now I'm going to come in with a fine mist spray and just soften that and let that diffuse down into the lighter shapes below. I want to create a little texture, a little irregularity in the trees, so I'm taking a spray bottle that has a bit of a coarse spray, and I'm just spritzing some water on those dark shapes, and then I'm rubbing it with a tissue, and it's very subtle, but it just gives some modulation, slight variation, and creates a subtle texture in these tree shapes. Now I'm going to paint the foreground, and it has combinations of some green tones and some gold tones, and a little lighter than what I've been working with in the trees. So here I've got some sap green, I have some permanent green light on the left there, so it's much brighter, and I add a little pyro red to give me a little bit of a neutral green, a little earthier green. And here I've got some quinacridone and gold that I'm mixing in, so that's going to give me a little bit more of a gold tone. And I'm going to take a little bit of quinacridone and coral, which I didn't list in the slide earlier, but this is the only place I use this, just a touch of quinacridone and coral in that quinacridone and gold mixture. And now I'm going to take my 1-inch flat brush, and I'm going to paint this just as a large shape with some variation of color and slight changes of value, just some modulation as it goes across the page. So I'm not trying to paint a bunch of blades of grass here in the foreground. So just big brush strokes, and the direction of my brush strokes helps tell the viewer the kind of the lay of the land, the contour of the land, that is somewhat flat here and horizontal going across. And you can see here I'm painting wet on dry, but as I go I'm putting touches of paint in the wet area, so I'm actually working a combination of wet on dry and wet as I go. So just big fresh brush strokes. I'm not trying to overdo the painting in this area. I want to draw the viewer into the house. I don't want to have a bunch of detailed rendering going on here in this foreground. And what I do want is to give the suggestion of some grassy shapes going up over this building. So I'm taking my scraper and I'm pushing that paint in a manner that creates a texture or pattern that suggests that there's grass overlapping that light shape. I'm going to use this scraper here in a few spots and just to try and create a little bit of texture, just a suggestion of this grassy activity, and the direction is vertical, so trying to represent some of these areas of grass that are just haphazardly. They kind of have some verticality to them as you go across the contour of that flat land. So using the scraping tool, I'm trying to give that feeling here of some of the bulkiness of the grass, even though it's a fairly flat area of land, and it just makes it a lot more interesting. And here you can see that I've started to make progress on a tree. And one of the challenges when making a video is there's a constant turning on and off of the camera. And sometimes you think it's on and it's not. And this would be one of those cases where I started to paint the tree and realized that my camera wasn't quite on. So I made a little bit of progress on here without being able to film it. But you can see the process. I'm using this 1/2-inch flat brush. I'm using some dark valued green mixture similar to what I use in the tree line. and I'm just giving the indication of the foliage on the tree and some suggestion of branches. But the mixture here has some of the sap green, royal blue, raw umber, some alizarin crimson, and there's some areas of this, even though it's very dark, that trunk of the tree is painted with a tone that's a little bit warmer than some of what I used. It helps differentiate it from some of the background, but it's the darkest value that I have in my painting. So it stands out over top of the tree line that I painted earlier. That's why I wasn't concerned about painting around the tree trunk itself. While this is still wet, I'm going to come in with a fine mist spray and just mist over the top of this to help soften the edges and diffuse some of that color and create a softness that otherwise would be hard to get with the brush techniques that I was using. Now I'm going to take some of that dark value mixture, and I'm using a liner brush here, or a rigger brush, and just making some branch shapes. Just taking those, some of those go over top some of the lighter areas, and that is the sky kind of coming in from behind this tree, and I have these linear shapes going over top of some of those openings. So the mixture I'm using is raw umber with a royal blue and some alizarin crimson. Makes a very dark color, and I can make it swing either warm or cool depending on the amounts of the colors that I have in there. Now I'm going to take a pickup eraser. I'm going to lift off the small amount of masking fluid that I used here on the lines. Now you can see that those shapes come through, and then that pole on the left. And those are the only areas that I masked. Now I'm going to paint this pole here, which is a dark shape. I want to have fairly clean edges on it. So I'm going to take some packaging tape, clear packaging tape. I'm going to put it on either side of the pole on the edge. So this is going to help me maintain a fairly straight shape with pretty clean edges. So I just put it on the edge, and I smooth the edge down a little bit. I'm not really pressing that hard. And then I'm going to take a dark mixture, and I'm going to paint that pole shape, that linear shape here. So I've got this dark value, and I have quite a bit of water in here, and actually I think I might be getting a little bit going under the edge. This works pretty well. Normally you don't have too much of that, but occasionally you get a little bit, but you don't get near as much as you do with masking tape. So I'm going to paint that base transitioning into the grass there, and I'm going to take this shape up. It goes all the way off the page, and I did get a little bit of seepage, not too bad, but it's going to give me a nice straight shape and with a pretty clean edge. I don't want that to feel like a stripe painted on the page, so I'm going to blot that, and that varies the color a little bit, creates a little pattern, a little texture in there. And then I'm going to put a little bit of paint here at the base, and I'm going to hit that with a fine mist spray just to soften that, let it diffuse, and just kind of transition down into the grass. Now I'm just taking a bit of a warm gray, dark warm gray, and I'm painting this linear pole shape here, and I'm trying to leave a little bit of that highlight on the right side of that pole to indicate that the light's hitting it. Painting some of the dark edges and some of these shapes of insulators that are kind of silhouetted on this transformer that's up on this power pole. So I'm just using this dark value and indicating that and painting the shadow side of the transformer itself. Next, I'm taking my rigger brush here with a fairly dark value. It's kind of a dark middle value, and just touching along where this wire comes from the top of the page down into the composition. So I'm not painting the whole thing. I'm leaving some breaks just to suggest light reflecting off of it and just giving some lost and found elements to that linear shape. And then it gets to the light area where I had masked, and it goes on into the tree line. So I rotate this board here so I can get a better angle as I paint this curve, and just blotting it with a tissue, breaking it up a little bit. And then I have that shape coming down in as a positive line, then it transitions into that light area over the dark where I had masked. And here I'm taking some of that dark value and giving an indication of a couple wires that come down off that transformer. Next, I'm going to paint the top of the roof for this building. So I'm mixing some cerulean blue, little quinacridone rose madder. Take this a little bit towards a violet. And then I'm going to take some raw sienna, which will gray this down a little bit. And then I'll use these combinations here of these three colors to paint the rooftop. Now I'm going to paint the rooftop here using the mixtures that I have just mixed on my palette. So I'm starting with a somewhat warm mixture here at the top. I'm using a 1/2 inch flat brush. My mixture is very fluid, and trying to keep a clean edge there so as I drag the tip of that flat brush along there. So it's a fairly warm mixture there to start, and I'm going to introduce now a cooler mixture leaning more towards violet. I'm going to bring that down along the edge, and I'm going to put this kind of a base wash down with some warm and cool color combinations. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to use some brush strokes that will do a better job of contouring the roof line to indicate the angle that the roof is at. So I've dried this, and now I'm going to come back with my 1/2 inch flat brush and some of the same mixtures, and I'm going to use some of these brush strokes to contour the roof and indicate the angle of the roof and just some of the patterns that are occurring because of the shingles up there. It's not my intent to paint lines around every shingle. I'm just trying to give a suggestion of that activity on the roof line. Here I'm going to take a fine mist spray and just soften up those edges a little bit and let the paint run. And I'm going to put a few touches in there again with my brush. And I'm trying still to try and contour the angle of the roof with some of those marks. Now I'm going to come in here, and I have a 1/2 inch flat brush and a dark value, and I'm going to describe some of the edges and some of the places where there's seams and a little bit of the detail on the structure. Now there's a gutter that's running down the side, and it's actually a kind of a dark middle value gray, almost a violet tone. So I'm going to paint that. Here I'm going to take a dark value. I'm going to give the indication of the window here on the side. It's very dark value, and there's this slight, these are multiple panes of glass, so there's a little divider in the window, so I'm just kind of painting negatively to fill that space and leaving the indication of the wood, the cross members that hold those panes of glass. And I'm just cleaning up the edge there on the edge of the roof. A little darker value here on the gutter. There's a downspout back here that's coming off the roof. That's a dark value, so I'm going to touch that. There's a hard edge here at the base of the house that you can pick up through the grass. So I'm going to give the indication of that right now using a dark value, using a number 4 round brush, and making some horizontal marks to give the indication that there's that kind of dark area there underneath the house. There's some type of an air conditioning box sitting out here. And so it's just a box shape here, and it's got a shadow side, so I just painted that shadow side of that. So the shadows on the back side of the house here, and on also on the side that's facing the viewer, I don't think is quite dark enough, so I'm going to come back over and glaze over top of what I have there. And I'm using a mixture of cobalt blue and quinacridone rose madder on that back side. I've added a little bit more cerulean blue into that mixture here on the actual side here that's facing the viewer. But I'm just taking that value down just a little bit and going back over that shape that is cast in shadow. And as I fill this shape in here, I'm going to want to carry this value over into the shadowed side on the overhang there on the back side of the building that you can't see, but you can see that overhang. So that's a bit, that shape continues on and with that value. There's layers of siding here on the sides of the structure, and they're spaced fairly close together. And I want to make sure when I make my brush marks and I'm keeping the right angles and trying to keep a relatively consistent spacing. So I'm going to use a straight edge here and a pencil just to make some marks to indicate where that siding is. And I'm not drawing complete lines. I'm lifting my pencil as I go along there and just giving breaks in it, because I'm not going to just draw a bunch of ruled lines or paint a bunch of lines from end to end. I'm just going to have broken lines that go across there. So I want to make sure my perspective is good. So I'm just going to put some light pencil lines in here. Here I'm doing the same thing. The angle's changed, and I'm just making light pencil marks here and there to give the indication of the siding as they overlap on the side of the building. So now I'm going to take a rigger brush, and I'm going to indicate where the edge of some of these boards are. There's a vertical board on the corner, so I'm making an indication of that on each side. And then I'm going to take this rigger brush and I'm going to follow some of those lines I penciled in, just giving slight indications that those shapes are there. And you can see when they intersect to the board that's perpendicular, they create a little pocket of value there. So I'm playing that up a little bit as I do this. But again, I'm not drawing lines from end to end, from corner to corner on the building. These are broken up as they go across. But I'm trying to keep the perspective right and make sure they're following the same angle. As I paint these, my mixture has varying amounts of cerulean blue, cobalt blue, and rosematic quinacridone. So some of it has more of a blue, cerulean blue tint, and other mixtures have a little bit more of a violet, red violet, or blue violet tint. And now I'm doing some of the same brushwork on the shadowed side, just light indications. There's some boards that frame that window in, and they create a little bit of shadow and some seams here. So I'm going to indicate that with just some line work. This building actually casts a shadow here, and it gets broken up by the tufts of grass that are coming up. So I'm trying to indicate that with some interruptions in the dark valued shape that I'm making there. So just giving a suggestion that there's a shadow being cast, and you can pick it up through the grass. I want a greater change in value here to indicate the edge underneath this roof line where there's a board. So going back in with a slightly darker value. This mixture has, again, some raw sienna, a little bit of royal blue, and then softening the edge and letting that just diffuse away with some water. And taking that same mixture and going underneath the edge of the roof there to darken that a little bit. Now I'm going to put a mat around the paintings to get a good look at it. And there's my painting, Hideaway. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want the reference material, you can go to my online learning center, click on the link at the top of the page for YouTube reference. If you have questions about my materials, you can always go to the studio page of my website, rsurwitzart.com. And if you have questions, you can email me at contact@rsurwitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.